Imagine navigating a 25,000-ton steel fortress right through a hurricane. You'd probably think the greatest threat to your life out there would be, I don't know, a massive hull breach or a catastrophic engine failure. But on August 17th, 1996, the deadliest threat on the container ship Matilda Bay was literally just a simple hatch cover. And it was tightened only by hand.
Yeah, that tiny oversight, it basically set off this chain reaction that stripped away every single illusion of control the crew had. So today we are diving into the official Australian Transport Safety Bureau, or ATSB, report number 97. It meticulously documents this fatal incident in the Great Australian Bight. And we're also bringing in contemporary maritime safety analyses and comparative case studies. So things like the 2020 APL England container loss and the 2024 Titan submersible disaster.
Right. The mission for your custom-tailored deep dive today is to examine exactly how a single, seemingly trivial human error can just violently unravel sophisticated safety systems. Okay, let's unpack this. We really need to start with the sheer scale of the Matilda Bay and the environment it was facing.
Well, the Matilda Bay was an absolute powerhouse of global trade. I mean, it was built in 1970, formerly known as the Arafura and the Chitral. It was 214 meters long, and it operated under a consortium of major shipping lines, powered by this massive Mitsui diesel engine generating over 25,000 kilowatts. And that's just to push it across the globe 23 knots.
Which is huge. That's over 2 football fields of solid steel. And it was crewed by this completely international team, right? A New Zealand master, a Malaysian chief officer, British officers, and Filipino crew members. I mean, this was a vessel explicitly designed to endure the absolute worst the oceans had to offer.
Exactly. And on the morning of August 17th, they were really testing that design. They were transiting from Melbourne to Fremantle right at the peak of the winter storm season. And the Southern Ocean, specifically the Great Australian Bight at that time of year, is just legendary for its hostility. The logbook actually recorded 4.7 southwest winds and a really heavy, towering swell. The vessel was pitching violently.
Okay, so most of us probably picture a ship in a storm with these dramatic splashes of sea spray hitting the deck. But the ATSB report draws a very sharp line between sea spray and a phenomenon they call green water.
Right, because sea spray, well, it looks dramatic, but it's entirely wind-driven, so it has relatively low kinetic energy. But green water, or a green sea, is a solid, unbroken mass of water that actually boards the vessel. It hasn't aerated at all.
So it's just pure, dense water.
Yeah, it maintains the exact density and velocity of the ocean itself.
Wow, so it's kind of like getting hit by sea spray is like standing in a hurricane, but getting hit by green water is like being hit by a runaway concrete wall.
That is a perfect analogy. Hundreds of tons of solid water were just sweeping across the forecastle, which is the front deck of the ship. And the dynamic pressure exerted by that volume of green water, I mean, it's capable of distorting solid steel fittings.
Which, begs the question, if this ship was built specifically to cross the globe, how does whether it was engineered to survive pose such a massive systemic threat?
Well, it kind of comes down to the vessel's internal architecture. The Matilda Bay featured these longitudinal underdeck passageways, and these corridors were built to let the crew walk from the machinery spaces all the way to the forecastle without ever stepping outside into the weather.
Oh, I see. So those passageways essentially act like a massive internal funnel.
Right.
If the front door on the deck is breached by a wave, and the internal fire doors, like the collision bulkheads, are left open, the sea basically bypasses the ship's entire armored hull.
Exactly. The water can flood the ship's nervous system directly, and that internal vulnerability is exactly what was exposed here. Because 39 hours earlier, when the ship left Melbourne, the bosun closed a small booby hatch on the forecastle deck.
A booby hatch?
Yeah, it's a raised access point designed for crew entry, but he only dogged it down hand tight.
Just hand tight. Against the compressive force of a runaway concrete wall of water.
Yeah. And the force of the green seas pitching over the bow created this massive pressure differential. So it didn't just pop the hatch open. It completely tore the heavy steel lid right off its hinges.
Unbelievable.
And because the internal watertight collision bulkhead doors had been left open deep inside those passageways, the floodwater just had a completely clear path.
Okay, so fast forward to 7:50 a.m. The ship's electrician is down checking refrigerated containers, and he notices water trickling all the way back to the main switchboard space.
Right. He immediately reports the breach to the machinery control room, and then the second engineer calls the bridge to alert the chief officer.
And I really struggle to understand this next part, because the chief officer is a highly experienced mariner. He gets the call about the breach, but he's skeptical. Like, he doesn't quite believe the hatch could actually be open.
Right, he doubts it.
So he decides to go forward to the most exposed part of the ship to investigate it personally, taking the bosun and 2 able seamen with him. But why step out into a storm with no radio? He doesn't tell the master, who was right there on the bridge. He doesn't even tell the newly arrived 3rd officer who just took over the watch. Is this just a case of professional pride overriding protocol? Or is this a universal symptom of workplace complacency where we think, I'll only be gone a second?
What's fascinating here is that it's a textbook example of situational overconfidence. It's a very well-documented psychological trap in highly competent professionals. You know, the ATSB report actually notes the chief officer was incredibly hands-on. And when you are that competent, you often bypass formal reporting structures because you just assume you can manage the risk intuitively. You think, I'll just go look, it'll take 2 minutes.
But in a volatile environment like that, bypassing protocol removes your safety net entirely. He effectively steps into a communication black hole. He creates a situation where the command center of the ship has 0 situational awareness that 4 men are out on the weather deck in force 7 conditions.
And the consequence of that missing safety net is severe, because if the 3rd officer had known those men were out there, he could have altered the ship's course to run with the weather, which would physically shield the bow while they worked. But because the bridge was blind to their location, they just kept pushing the ship right into the teeth of the storm.
Man, that is grim. And out on the forecastle, the situation is completely falling apart. The 4 men find the hatch lid torn off.
Yeah.
And we actually learn from the sources that a vital piece of hardware, a bottle screw, was completely missing from a previous repair.
Yeah, a bottle screw is essentially a heavy-duty turnbuckle that's used to crank down and tension a massive load. So without it, the hatch was fundamentally compromised before the storm even hit.
So the lid is so distorted from the wave impact, they can't even force it back onto the hinges. The chief officer sends the bosun down to get canvas and plywood, trying to rig some kind of temporary cover. And while they were exposed on the bow, wrestling with this hand-tight mistake, the ship plunges deeply into a trough.
Right. And environmental data from the report indicates the combination of the wind wave and the heavy swell periodically created these peak-to-trough walls of water up to 15 meters high.
A 15-meter wave. That's a 5-story building of solid green water crashing directly onto the deck.
Exactly. The 3 men had virtually no warning. The green sea swept 1 able seaman completely over the top of the ship's massive anchor windlass, throwing him against a mooring winch, and then it washed the 2nd seaman violently against the side of the windlass.
And for anyone who doesn't know, an anchor windlass isn't just a simple winch. It is a massive, brutal piece of heavy-geared machinery designed to haul up tons of iron chain.
It is. And the chief officer was swept entirely underneath the windlass operating platform. He was instantly trapped inside the ship's heavy steel machinery. So the physical structure of the vessel itself became the instrument of his trauma.
The aftermath must have been sheer chaos.
Absolute chaos. The seaman who was thrown over the windlass is stunned. He's bleeding from his head. He looks around, doesn't see the chief officer or the other seamen, and just assumes they've been washed out to sea. So he scrambles down to the main deck, terrified another wave is coming, and he runs right into the bosun.
And he tells the bosun the men are gone.
Yeah. The bosun immediately sends another crew member, the watchkeeping seaman, sprinting to the bridge to alert the officers.
And here's where it gets really interesting in a tragic way. In his state of sheer panic, the watchkeeping seaman bursts onto the bridge and defaults to his native language, pleading for help. But the British 3rd officer on watch cannot understand a single word he's saying.
No, they were bleeding precious seconds in a life-or-death emergency entirely because of a language barrier. It actually takes a Filipino cadet who just happens to be on the bridge stepping in to translate before the 3rd officer finally grasps the phrase, "man overboard."
This fatal delay really highlights a systemic issue that the RSIS study on maritime English in your sources dives into.
Yes, the International Maritime Organization estimates roughly 80% of maritime incidents stem from human error, and nearly half of those human errors are directly linked to communication failures. The RSIS study cites the Matilda Bay, alongside the infamous 1990 Scandinavian Star disaster, to show how a lack of standardized language during a crisis turns an emergency into a full-blown tragedy. When a crew is multinational, technical proficiency just isn't enough to save you. You need standardized verbal reporting loops.
Because without a shared language, the bridge basically becomes a high-stakes game of telephone where the penalty for a mistranslation is someone's life. So the third officer hears man overboard and immediately initiates a Williamson turn. And that's a classic nautical maneuver to retrace the ship's exact path to find someone floating in the water. He's sounding alarms, he's waking the master, trying to coordinate a massive search and rescue in the open ocean.
But the actual tragedy is quietly unfolding right on their own deck. The chief officer isn't lost at sea, he's bleeding out underneath the anchor windlass.
While the bridge is frantically scanning the horizon, the injured seaman, still up on the forecastle, finally recovers enough to crawl across the deck. He finds the chief officer trapped under the windlass platform. He tries talking to him, gets no answer, and eventually crawls back to the main deck to scream for the bosun.
And keep in mind, it takes roughly 35 minutes from the time the wave hit for the crew to even realize the chief officer is still on board. The bosun reluctantly goes forward, finds him with catastrophic head and chest injuries, and they finally manage to stretcher him aft to the ship's hospital.
Which then triggers a totally different kind of nightmare, right? The medical crisis. Because at 9:47 a.m., the master contacts the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Canberra, asking for an urgent helicopter medevac.
But remember their geographic reality. They are in the middle of the Great Australian Bight, pushing through force 7 weather, hundreds of miles from the nearest shore. The rescue center basically informs them a helicopter rescue is simply impossible, given the range and the storm.
How terrifying is that? This exposes the absolute isolation of maritime transport. Out there on the open ocean, you aren't just driving a cargo ship. You are your own hospital, your own fire department, and your own search and rescue squad. You are entirely self-reliant. And the Matilda Bay was tragically under-equipped for that reality.
Very much so. A shore-based doctor consulting via radio recommends administering oxygen at a flow rate of 4 liters per minute to treat the massive trauma. But the ship's onboard oxygen system could only deliver a maximum of 1.5 liters per minute. And furthermore, they only had 2 small cylinders on the entire ship.
Wait, really? A multi-million-dollar floating fortress moving thousands of tons of cargo around the world, and it has medical gear you'd be disappointed to find in a basic first aid kit. How does a massive industrial operation justify that level of unpreparedness?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the regulatory baselines of that era were built around statistical probabilities of routine illnesses and minor workplace cuts. They weren't really planning for catastrophic blunt force trauma. Ships basically carried what the regulations explicitly mandated and rarely anything more. So despite the master and officers performing continuous CPR and rationing what little oxygen they had, the injuries were just too severe. The chief officer passed away at 1:30 p.m.
That is just awful. And because of their isolation, they still had to get the ship to port. The officers had to wash and prepare their colleague's body using a basic medical guide, place him in a body bag, and literally store him in the ship's refrigerated meat room for the remainder of the voyage to Fremantle.
It is a grim, sobering reality. But the ATSB report on the Matilda Bay wasn't just filed away in a cabinet somewhere. It became a foundational document that actually forced systemic changes across global shipping standards.
So the ripple effects from this specific preventable death were immediate then?
Very immediate. Directly out of the Matilda Bay incident, the industry saw a massive push for mandatory permit-to-work systems for hazardous deck activities. A chief officer could no longer just decide to walk out onto the forecastle in a storm based on his own intuition. It required formal, documented risk assessment. It mandated portable radios for any personnel working on deck, and strict, unbreakable rules requiring the bridge to be notified of any movement to weather decks.
It was essentially an attempt to regulate the communication black hole out of existence. But the sources provided for this deep dive show us that while the regulations evolved, the nature of maritime accidents just sort of shifted to exploit different human flaws.
Yeah, if we compare the Matilda Bay in 1996 to the container ship APL England in 2020, the contrast in how human error manifests is striking. The APL England lost 50 shipping containers overboard in heavy seas off the coast of Sydney. But the ATSB preliminary report for that incident didn't point to a single crew member walking out into a storm with a hand-tightened hatch.
Right. No, the failure on the APL England was institutional. Inspectors found systemic maintenance failures. The ship's lashing eyes and lashing bridges, which are the heavy metal securing points that hold the containers to the deck, were heavily corroded and wasted away.
Exactly. And on top of that structural neglect, they were stacking high cube containers. High cubes are taller than standard containers, so stacking them alters the entire wind profile and raises the center of gravity of the stow. When the ship rolled in the heavy seas, the physics simply overpowered the corroded securing points.
So the Matilda Bay had relatively sound structural fittings, but it was defeated by an immediate human error in the dogging process and an arrogant decision to expose personnel. Whereas the APL England was defeated by a slow, creeping complacency regarding maintenance and loading physics.
We also see parallels in command breakdowns. The Sea Empress oil spill, which happened the exact same year as Matilda Bay, shared that identical theme of a breakdown in command and control on the bridge. It just resulted in a massive environmental disaster rather than a single fatality.
Which leads us to perhaps the most resonant comparison to your stack of sources, the Titan submersible disaster of 2024.
The Titan is the perfect modern lens for this. In the hearings following the implosion of that submersible, Ebenezer March, the national president of the Master Mariners of Canada, provided a quote that encapsulates everything we've discussed today. He stated, "Safety is not a moving target. It is the target."
That distinction completely reframes how we look at industrial safety.
It does. OceanGate, the company behind the Titan, operated with a Silicon Valley profit-driven culture that intentionally bypassed independent certification. They viewed safety regulations as a bureaucratic barrier to innovation. They chose to build a hull out of uncertified carbon fiber because they genuinely believed they could outsmart the established physics of the deep ocean.
They just ignored the fact that the strict maritime frameworks they were bypassing, specifically SOLAS, the safety of life at sea regulations, are entirely reactive. Every single rule on the books is written in blood. They are directly tied to disasters exactly like the Matilda Bay.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? SOLAS didn't invent rules to stifle innovation. SOLAS recorded the exact mechanisms of past fatalities to prevent them from happening again. The Matilda Bay tells us that you can build a massive 25,000-ton steel fortress, but if a single human being makes a minor miscalculation about a hatch, the ocean will exploit it. The Titan tells us that if leadership actively ignores the historical lessons of the ocean, the physics remain just as unforgiving.
So what does this all mean? The Matilda Bay reminds us that the ocean does not care about the size of your engine, the pedigree of your global shipping consortium, or the arrogance of your engineering. A single hand-tight latch, a missed radio call, and a language barrier are all it takes for the sea to win.
And understanding these historical domino effects is vital. Whether you work in logistics, aviation, healthcare, or any high-stakes environment, really, the architecture of safety is built on recognizing how a small communication gap, like a missing radio or a misunderstood phrase, cascades into a catastrophic system failure.
It definitely makes you look at the systems we rely on every single day with a lot more scrutiny. As we wrap up this deep dive, there's one final thought we want to leave you with. Right now, the global shipping industry is racing toward fully automated autonomous cargo ships. The ultimate goal is to remove the crew entirely, effectively eliminating human error from the equation. But if you take away the humans, are we actually making the ocean safer? Or are we just replacing the visible risk of a misspoken word on a bridge with the invisible, unfixable risk of a silent line of broken code? Something to mull over the next time you see a massive cargo ship sitting quietly on the horizon.